So this is part 2 of how to make tie backs, and the first part I've already done. I shall link to that up here, and that was for a bound tie back. And if you recall, if you've watched that video, I did cut out all the pieces for this tie back, a piped tie back, which is what I'm going to do today, and also for just a plain lined tie back. I did make one change actually. I forgot when I was making the cutting the linings for the pipe tie back. Of the 3 pieces of lining that you need to cut, 2 of them you can cut on the bias. It makes it a lot easier. I think I just cut them straight on the first video, not really thinking. We'll get that out of the way. We've done that. You will need a piece of buckram already cut, and then like I was saying, the 2 pieces of lining that go inside the tie back that you just don't see at all. And all they're doing is encasing this piece of buckram, like so. And because of that, it doesn't matter what fabric it is. I tend to use something quite thin. This is just 100% cotton sateen lining, and it's a bit finer and softer, but you can use anything. You can use sheeting, anything, as long as it just needs to be stable, but it doesn't have to be very thick. And of course, just be careful of the colour, because you will eventually put a normal lining on the back of your tie back, and you don't want something that's going to show through. So the idea of cutting this on the bias instead of just completely straight is because it's going to curve. Now we can mitigate that just by the way that we sew it, which I'll show you, and we did with the bound tie back, but it's a little bit harder to handle when it's piped, so this just helps that process a bit more. So we've got 2 pieces of lining cut on the bias. Basically they're just huge big pieces of bias piping. I have enough piping cut on the bias to go around the tie back. Okay. And then your face fabric, cut straight, cut according to the pattern, whatever you prefer. This just happens to be the same. And then I almost forgot, interlining. This is just a piece of cotton domette interlining. I find it's the nicest stuff. Just cut straight, no need to cut this on the bias. Just the same as the face bit of fabric, you can cut that straight. And then finally, the lining, last thing to go on, goes on the back. And of course you'll want this to match. If you're doing curtains to match, you'll want this to match your curtain. This is a typical DB1 type sateen lining, a little bit thicker than this one that goes on the inside. So first I shall be sewing these pieces, so we'll do that now. Okay, so we've got our 2 pieces of bias cut lining. Just do away with one for now, and this one we want to sew on the front of the lining, the buckram. So just starting really close to the edge of the buckram, only a couple of mil in. Start itself off first and then curl the buckram over, and this will give you that shape without you creating any holes or buckles in the linings. And then continue on round, holding this curve and just letting it unfurl as you go. And then when you get to the other end, you should find that where you've been holding it should be in exactly the same place. Keep going round. And then back up the other side, holding it again in that curve. And then all the way up this side, just taking care that you've not got a big pucker under here. Keep just checking it's smooth and holding this curve, letting it unfurl as you go. And again, once you get to the other end, to where you started. Okay, so that's one side. And then you want to trim this off, but not, I'll just show you on the right side what it looks like. And you can gently press this if you want as well, just to get rid of the creases. I mean, there's a crease line in it there, but it's not going to do any harm. And just get rid of these little tiny puckers that you might have, but it's really not necessary at this point. And what I want to do is trim this down, just so I can see it, just to a normal seam allowance, whatever you would normally be happy with. You can trim it down again afterwards, so it's not set in stone. But it just helps you at this point for you to see where you're going, basically. You've got a stitch line as well, and the edge of the buckram that you can feel, but I just find it helps to get a sense of the overall finished shape. Okay, and now you want to put this piece on the front, sorry, on the back. And again, working on the non-lining side is probably the best way of describing it. But this time, you want to sew next to the buckram through just the 2 layers of lining, and that creates your sort of pocketed piece of buckram and an edge for you to pipe onto. But for this you'll need to change your foot. So I have my half foot here. Now this time, because you're sewing on the face, you don't have to curl it. So I'm sewing now just right hard up against the edge of the buckram. If you want, run your fingernail. If you run your fingernail down next to the buckram, you can create a line to stitch to. That helps. Otherwise, you can just feel your way and hug it with the foot. You want to get close. So otherwise you end up with a pretty unstable, baggy sort of effect. And round the ends. Just taking care to keep that nice and flat. If you get this bit right, the rest is much easier. So it's worth taking your time over this bit to get a really good structure underneath inside. And you may wonder actually at this point why I don't just sew one piece of lining on right near the edge and have this, basically this first piece, and pipe onto that. Well, I did used to try and do it that way, but I could never get this edge really neat. It would, because you can only sew so close to the edge of the buckram, it would always give you there was always a bit of manoeuvring, a bit of pulling away from the edge. It would never quite sit right. So I find this way it just gives a much better finish. It's worth the effort. Anyway, so there we go. There's the back piece on, nice and flat, and because it's bias, it'll fold nicely. But again, it's got a tiny bit of gaping, but that will go once you press it, and once you've got the other bit lining on the back as well. So same thing again. Trim this down. And what I find, if I'm doing a pair or, you know, several pairs, I often do all the same processes at once. So I would put all the linings on the back, on the front, sorry. Then I'll put the linings on the back, so I only have to change my foot once. Okay, so that's your structure ready to stitch to now. Now if we could buy tie backs like that, it'd be lovely, wouldn't it? But of course tie backs are all different sizes, so can't be so. Okay, so now the bit I nearly forgot, which is the interlining. Can't believe I nearly forgot that. You want that to go between the linings and the face fabric. Basically it wants to be underneath the face fabric. So again, checking the curl of your tie back, your buckram, so you know which is your front. That's the front of your tie back. Lay it on the interlining, make sure it's smooth, and then same method as the first piece, curl it. Not forgetting this isn't cut on the bias, so you need to give it that curl so you don't get any pulling. But then sewing next to the buckram. Now you've got a stitch line here, which is very handy, from the second row stitching that you did, so you can follow that exactly. Keep a hold of it quite firmly with your hand so it doesn't run away with you, and start pulling. And then, like I said, holding this curl and just letting it unfurl as you go. Now you may wonder at this point why I don't sew the interlining straight through the buckram, straight through the edge of the buckram, just the same as I did the first piece of lining that I put on. And actually I did used to do it that way, but what I found was the stitch line would leave a sort of furrow, particularly in heavier interlinings like bump interlining, or even a thicker domette like the one I'm using now. And then if I was using plain fabrics or really fine fabrics like silk or satin, you could see that ridge line all the way around the edge of the tie back. So I switched to stitching it through the seam allowance instead, and then cutting it right back. That seemed to work better. You can also stick this on. You can use some SFT or something and stick this on just to the face, because it really doesn't add anything to the structure. It just gives a bit of padding, just interlines it. It's the linings that are doing the work. But I find, I'm at the machine, I find it just a better method personally to sew it on. And again, get that curl going straight away so you've not got any pulling. There we go, back where we started. Okay, so there we have your interlining on the face, and you'll see it's just got a bit of fullness to it there, a bit of gaping, and that's good. You want that, because when you turn it, curl it, it's not pulling. It's not. The acid test to me is that if you can flop that over and it stays there without there being any buckling or gaping or anything, it's going to be a good tie back. Now, probably one of the trickiest bits is to trim this. Personally, I don't like to leave it, I don't like to cut it with the seam allowance. I like to cut it right back. It just gives a better finish. So get your scissors in between the interlining and the linings, and right up against that stitch line without catching this. Actually, if you do catch the stitches every so often, it really doesn't like I just did then. As long as most of it's held, just make sure you don't catch that lining underneath. Keep your scissors. Sort of flat against the lining underneath, and you'll see as I'm starting to cut it that it's really just a mil or mil and a half, and that's enough just to hold the interlining while you're making it. There we go. So those are all your linings, interlining, all ready for the face fabric. So now it's obvious which way is which. This is your face, and as you can see, you're not really handling it much more now. Once you sew this on, it's pretty stable. So it doesn't matter if you've nicked a couple of bits of the stitching with when you've trimmed the interlining. You do want to get it pretty smooth, the cut. I mean, like a couple of lumpy bits there that I might just choose to trim off, because that's going to make up the edge of your tie back next to the piping. Anyway, which way up are we? That way. That's the right way up. I've got selvage here, I just want to make sure I'm well in from the selvage. And then again, lots of stitch lines, but it's still quicker and a much better finish, I find, than trying to just pipe it separately and then wrapping it round. I never find it gives it a really stable finish, and it's not structurally, it's not that brilliant, I find. Now this time you want to sew next to the buckram again, but not right up to it. So using the stitch lines you've already made, just sew it a mil out from that, and that's so that when you put the piping on, you're not really chancing revealing any of the stitch line. You can actually change your bottom spool as well to something that will match this, because you're now stitching onto the, the bottom spool will be coming through to the face here. It should be covered up by the piping, but there's still a chance it shows occasionally. But I find it's better to do it in white. If it shows, just trim it out. So again, quite critical this time, keeping this curve, and like I say, a mil out from the stitch lines that you've made already. Hopefully you can see that there, look. Now those are all the original ones, and then this is the new one I'm doing now. But because you're stitching away from it, you're creating an unstable area. You've got to make sure you keep this nice and flat when you're coming round the curves, but we'll get to that in a minute. Hang on. Okay, now once you've got to a point where you sort of can't hold that curl, lay it flat, but make sure you keep a really nice flat turn. Okay, now see here, this is already tending to start to wanting to pull. So just check that you've got it all in the right place. And what will happen here is this stitch line will want to sort of do that. It's very hard to show it actually on the camera, but it'll want to start to pull like that. But you've got to ensure that you keep that flat out from the edge. So just make sure you've got a, in fact you can just put a pin in, make it easier on yourself. You can pin through the buckram, you can pin just through the linings. Remember that lining underneath is really stable, so if you want to just stick a couple of pins in, just so you know that when you get to that end where you need to be sewn and that it's going to be in the right place. And then don't be tempted to sew too far away from here, because it becomes hard to handle with this business here, sort of pulling, and so you know it's tempting to just whiz round quite away from the tie, you know, the edge of the buckram, just so that you've got the fabric held in place, but it's better sewn near but not right on that line. Okay, so now we're coming around here. I just want to fight it just a little bit to make sure that this bit isn't pulling back under here. I want to keep it out. I can feel that's nice and flat now. Okay. Right, there's a tiny bit of rippling there, but that will press out really easily. It's where those two ends met. But this end you can see that it's really nice. But I can feel here, this is already starting to pull underneath. But when you sew the piping on, you'll be able to pull that back out so it's nice and flat. So just check at this point that when you turn your tie back that you've not got any ripples or gaping. And I can feel it just gaping a little bit there, but I know that when I press that and it's all sewn together, that it'll hold down flat. So, piping. I'm going to change my thread to red. Fingers crossed I have a red spool. Yes. You'd think I'd set that up, wouldn't you? I didn't. Chance. Probably from the last one I did. Actually, I don't think I've used much red since then. Okay, so I just want to make this piping up. And then it's quite a thick linen this, so I tend to just trim these down a bit. I will just press this as well, just to get rid of the bulk. I'll just press it. Okay. Now, if you want to, you can make this piping up first. So basically put your cord in, machine down there. Don't go really tight, don't exactly do it slack, because then the cord will just fall out and you'll be struggling with it. But don't do it super tight, because then you've got to do it super tight again when you sew it on there, and you can just do it with a bit of leeway so you can sew one side, the inside of the line that you've just made. But I'm going to put this straight on. So I decide where I want my join. That's going to be the good end of my tie back. So this will be the back. This is the face. So I'm just going to put my join about here. And what I tend to do is just leave a good few inches, and then I can feel where I am on the buckram with my nails. I tend to just push against the edge of the buckram. So then holding the piping in, like I said, I've got my nails here and I can push against the buckram. I can feel where it is, and I've got this line here, but I just know I want to be inside that line, this stitch line. Remember, you just sewed it ever so slightly away from the edge of the buckram, so you want to be sewing just next to it. So if you want, you can use that, just keep lifting and checking that you're going to be within it. Make sure your seams are opened flat and your piping cord's pushed right against that, so you don't get a lumpy transition over that join. You can always go back over it as well. If you feel you've just been pushed away a bit by that join, you can go over it and get a neater edge. And then when you get around here, just make sure that you've got this fabric pulled out flat from the edge of the buckram. Sometimes you need 3 hands. And then even though this is on the bias, you want to just ease back a bit. Don't put this on tight, because it ends up flipping back or forward on the edge rather than sitting out from the edge. So get it in line and then just sort of ease back, so you add in a bit of fullness back in. And that's harder to do actually if you make the piping up first, so tend to get a slightly better finish doing it this way. So this is the trickiest bit. Just take your time to get it in the right place first before you commit to sewing. I might have created a bit of a lump there. Might have to go back. So again, make sure your piping's pushed right into that seam. The fewer the joins in your piping, the better. I've got quite a few in this, and only because I'm running low on that red fabric, but if you've got the option, make sure you get a really nice long piece of bias cut binding with no joins in it. It's a much better job. But if you're like me, you end up having to use up bits of things. Carrying on around, keeping it flat, this bit nice and flat. Push up against it with your nails. So remember, even on this one as well, just lay it flat and then push back a bit just to ease in some fullness, so that piping's not going to be tight. Push down with your fingers to get it smooth. Okay, so now I'm at my join, and I want to do an angle join to match. So I'm just going to chop this off. I don't need it. Stitched a bit too far actually. So I know that that's there. That's my stitch line. So I just want to cut off there. Sew those two ends together. You can overlap the ends, do any way you would normally for joining piping, whichever you prefer. I prefer this way, it just gives a nicer finish. Can't tell where the join is. Just check it before I trim it off. And then just trim that back. Push it flat with my nails. Just finish over that join. Make sure your two ends of your cord meet. Okay. So my battery ran out, so I'm not sure if you caught all that, but basically I was trimming down the piping, and rather than just trim all the layers in one go and creating quite a thick step, because there's 3 layers of fabric here and the piping is quite a thick linen, rather than do that, I'm cutting them down in sort of tapering it down as I cut them. So the first layer I'm cutting is the top layer of the piping to about 1/4 inch from the piping itself, and then the next one I'll cut the next layer of fabric from the bottom of the piping just a little bit further away, just so it's staggered, it's not all one layer on top of the other. I just find it gives a nicer finish rather than a big step down. It's just easier to press it down, it's easier to finish off, and just gives a softer finish on the back, less lumpy. Technical term. So this one's probably 3 or 4 mil away from the edge of the other one. Okay, and then finally the fabric itself. And if it's still too much, you can trim it a bit further if you want. But you'll see I've just created 1, 2, 3 layers just staggered rather than all cut on top of each other. Don't make this top cut too short, because you've still got to turn it and you've still got to need something to stitch to. About 1/4 of an inch is about right. And you don't want this overall too wide at the end here, because you've got to turn that and lay it flat. You can snip it, we will be snipping it, but even so. So there we go. The last bit now is to put the lining on. Just trim that down a bit more. And if you want at this point, just double check all your stitching. If there's anything showing, there's a little bit of stitching showing there, but I'll probably just unpick that, and it's barely much, might not even show actually. But most of it's hidden, because it's close enough to the buckram. It's where the piping is, where the join is in the piping. So I'm just going to re-stitch that now, just to hug it a bit closer to the buckram. Might just be able to lose that stitch line. There we are, it's gone now. Can't see it now. Okay, now the last bit is the lining. Now there's two ways of doing this. There's a quick way and there's a slower way. And actually it depends how you want it to look on the back as well. I understand to see hand sewing on the back of a tie bag is a good thing. It shows that it's a quality product, it's handmade, it's hand finished with the lining on the back. But I find it's much quicker and you get a really super neat job if you machine the bottom row. Okay, so right sides together. Yet again, there's two schools of thought, which is the right side of a sateen lining. I tend to use the satiny side, so I shall put that facing that. Turn it over. Just make sure that it's... Now this is going to end up on the back, so there's no real need to do the curling business, because actually you want to really do the opposite, so that it's curling inside the tie back. So this time you just want to start off, don't start right on the edge. It's very hard to get this curve right, but it's much easier to do that by hand. So I start just underneath this curve. And this is another opportunity to get close in on those stitch lines again, because you can see them this time on the back. You can tidy a few up. So just do the up. Don't curl this back this way. Just let it fall. But make sure that you've got this flat down and you're up close against the buckram again. I've just slipped away a bit. I'm just going to move back because it's pushed. Just another joint, I can feel it under there. So just fight it back a bit so you're close to the buckram. And you want to be stitching either on top of that last red stitch line you can see there, which is the one you've just done putting the piping on, or inside it. Just make sure you're not getting this twisted. And this time put a bit of ease in the opposite way. So your line is tight on the inside. And just, you have to push the piping out the way underneath. Just push it underneath the edge of the buckram just to get it out the way, so that you're not catching that, you're not stitching the cord itself. And then just finish off about there. Okay, so we'll just tidy this up, trim off the bottom. That's where, see, that's where I'm starting to run off. I went back. And I'm just going to tidy this off. I'm not going to trim too close yet. I'll do that once I've turned it, but what I'll do is I'll taper in and just cut this to pretty much the same as the face fabric. Maybe a little bit longer again, so again you're just doing a little bit more staggering. So there we go, that's all the sewing finished. Now we can turn it through, see what it looks like. Okay, so final thing we need to do is to snip round here, just so that that will ease back much easier. And the easiest way to do that is to turn it over, and I tend to cut in, put a good few notches in like that. What's that, 5? 2, 3, 4, 5. That should just give you enough for it to lay flat. See, all those notches are coming together now. So I'll do the same on the other end. And then all that remains is to turn it. Now, I used to put a couple of notches along here, but it tended to not really need it. We'll try it without. And then you've just got to do some pushing and shoving to get it laying exactly as you want it. And then push this lining up. Like that. And then what I'll do now is I'll press along there and I'll press that down. Just make sure you've got the lining really pushed up. Don't put too much steam on at this point, because if you've got buckram in there, and particularly if you're using hessian, that can switch mine off. It can make the hessian soft and then buckle, and you'll never get it flat again. This isn't quite so bad, this synthetic stuff, but it can still still steaming, that iron. I've switched it off. But... Okay, and then round the end, just mould that so you get a nice curved shape. And then using the point of the iron, just push it down flat. And then continue round, laying the piping flat and pushing the edge against the back of the tie back. So the same thing at this end. Bit of moulding. So you've got a curve rather than a straight notched sort of affair. And then I just lay it down like that. And trim the lining off. I can still give myself a bit of, don't forget your stitch line is going to be back here, not here where the edge, the turn of the lining is going to be. So it looks like I'm quite close there, but it's like a 1/2 inch making seam allowance. You can draw a line if you want, just whiz around there with a pencil line, then you don't have to keep it flat on the table, then you can be a bit more sure then about where your line's going to be. And when you get to these ends, just open it out. Okay, so now the last bit, which is to turn the lining. And just sort of ease your way around, turning and sort of rolling and turning as you go, and then hold where you've been. And then get some pins in there to hold it in place. Where it's a little bit sort of pointy ended, you can ease that out when you hand sew it and get a nicer curved shape. I tend not to press this bit, I just sort of crease it with my fingers because it's hard to get the needle. If you press a really sharp crease in there, A, it's hard to alter as you're sewing it, and B, it's hard to actually get your needle through the crease if you do it that way. So it tends to gape a bit more if you leave it like this. It's easy to sew. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point, you just want to know that you've got it in place. And make sure that you're not leaving this bit too baggy here. Get it nice and flat across, top to bottom, tight. I'm just going to put a couple of snips in there. It's just pulling against me a bit. Right, didn't do it that end. It is a bit actually. I might just do the same there. Just ease it, let it lay a bit flatter. Yeah, it's a bit better. Now, it'll look a bit lumpy at the moment, fear not. So, we'll hand sew this. Okay, so starting right in this crook of this seam while we finished off the machining. I do a couple of stitches in the piping and then through the edge of the lining. Keep close to the stitch line, but don't go through both layers of the piping so that you see the stitching on the front. And then I keep the stitching quite small around the curve. And then once you've got a bit of it, pull that tight. You can see it start to close. See, and I've got rid of those sort of pointy creases, so it's a nice smooth curved finish. And keep going quite small round the curve until you get onto the straight. Then once you get onto the straight bit, you can keep going at that stitch rate if you want to, or you can get a little bit longer. I tend to do it probably about like that. If it's too big it'll gape, so don't go mad. Just check occasionally that you're not coming through to the front of the piping with your stitches. You can feel when you are, but if you've got quite a thin fabric for your piping, it's harder to judge. Should have got a chair. I got my stool. There. So stitched up. I'm just going to run an iron along there, just to flatten down that seam. So when you turn it now, it looks a bit like that, but if you just spend a bit of time manipulating it, you will get it to do what you want. Sometimes you need to just push the buckram sort of to the edges. It's hard to explain it really, to make sure that it's eased in and sitting in its right position. And then I'm just going to press it on the back as well. And then as you turn it, just hold it, and where you've pressed it, it'll just set it in the right position. So there we go. All that remains is a couple of rings for the front of the tie back. I'll set that one in and I'll stitch it there, and I'll go through the buckram inside. I won't go through to the front, just the buckram inside, and come back a couple of times so it's firm. It's not going to be bagging on the lining. And then on the back of the tie back, I'll just sew it right on the end of the piping. So annoyingly, my battery's just run out on my other camera, close-up camera, so I'll just finish this off on this one. So this is my good end, the front of the tie back, and then I'll get in there and I'll catch a good, a good sort of 1/4 inch, maybe a bit less than that, of the buckram, but not go through to the front. So I've felt my way through there, just through the buckram. And that creates a much firmer hold. And then if you bar tack across the bottom, just finishes it off a bit neater. Put your threads inside. I'll swap to red thread to do this other end on the piping itself. Same again, if you bar tack across the ends of these stitches, it just looks a bit neater. So there we go, all finished. That's the back, that's the front. You see I've used the flowers on the end here, and it's a really nice stable buckram finish. You've got the interlining in there, so it's a real tailored finish, and it seems like a lot of work. It seems overkill for tie backs, but it's one of those things that once you get used to doing it, because most of it's done at the machine, you can really start to speed up a bit. Obviously I've slowed it down to show you, but you can really get going. I ended up doing all my tie backs like this when tie backs were more popular, but they do seem to be coming back. So there we go, pipe tie back. I hope that was useful, the video, and it was informative. But if you've got any queries or comments or suggestions or questions, just comment below and I'll do my best to answer. If there are any tutorials that you want to see that you can't find, aren't available, then let me know and I'll see what I can do, if I'm able to make one. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you're new to the channel, just please consider subscribing. That really helps the channel and spurs me on to do more. So thank you very much. Goodbye.